Hi, James. Thanks so much for joining me on this episode of Concentrating on Chromatography. I appreciate it.
I'm excited to be here.
My Green Lab's one of my favorite organizations in the space, and I was able to have one of your colleagues on last year to talk about sustainability. So, very happy to do it with the CEO of the organization. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm excited for the conversation.
And My Green Lab really started as a grassroots movement, as I understand it, and you're influencing all sorts of different organizations and different industries, pharmaceutical companies, universities, manufacturers like myself at Organimation, and even UN initiatives. At what point did you realize this had become something much larger than a basic sustainability program?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it did develop very much organically, right? We started with a bunch of academics in the US, scientists that were just fed up with the environmental impact of research and they wanted to do something about it. And so, we began to build a standard really as a way to simplify so everybody wasn't building their own tools independently. What if we collaborated on a single tool and that then became My Green Lab? I joined the organization first as a strategic advisor. So we were founded by a neuroscientist, a Harvard educated neuroscientist named Allison Paradise that got fed up with the environmental impact of research. She met a great community of individuals that had a similar issue, and then they realized that the market would be best served by having it all under the umbrella of a nonprofit organization. And so I started advising her on sort of growth strategy, fundraising, really putting the pieces in place for it to be a scalable certification standard. And I think it was when we were first mentioned by three different CEOs in their earnings calls when I joined after I became a strategic advisor. I joined the board and then eventually I became CEO when Allison decided to pursue some personal passions. And there was one week where literally three CEOs of Fortune 50 companies mentioned My Green Lab in their earnings call or in press releases that they put out as key to their sustainability strategy as well as ACT, that I was like, oh man, this is the thing. We have the attention of executives at the highest level. And we knew we always had a great community, particularly in academia. But I think that expansion into the commercial space where they can deliver things at scale with so many more resources was really exciting. On the academic side, I would say definitely when the Wellcome Trust started requiring My Green Lab certification or equivalent as part of their funding requests, the second or the first or the third largest foundation, depending on their investment portfolio, and Novo Nordisk Foundation and the Gates Foundation requiring sustainability for their grantees. That was a huge shift in the market, in the industry. And I think really established that, Green Labs was going to be a thing, and we had the potential to really become the global standard.
Absolutely. And I'm excited to talk with you, but I also think it's a timely conversation as well, Justin, that obviously everything's progressing so quickly. I think we were overdue to have an update here. I spoke about a lot of the different organizations that My Green Lab touches. Among those laboratory leaders, what are some of the biggest misconceptions people still have about sustainability in the lab space?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception continues to be that it's somehow going to slow down or interfere or, be an additional cost or burden on the laboratory. And in fact, what we find is a lot of the recommendations we have are really about running a more efficient, a smarter lab in many ways that doesn't reduce the amount of research you can do. It can actually accelerate it. Maybe there's some, startup costs because you need to think about putting in place an inventory management system or be more thoughtful about what pieces of equipment you can turn on or turn off. But a lot of the recommendations are really very straightforward behavior change ideas that pretty much anybody can implement in their research. And our program isn't prescriptive, meaning, if it doesn't make sense to implement that particular action, you can skip over it. But every lab has areas where they can make improvement. And the exciting thing is we're seeing significant financial return on investment. So for most labs, they'll see at least 5x for commercial labs, and in academic, it can be much greater than that. 10, 20x. Sometimes we've even seen like 30x return on investment. So, from a resource standpoint, it actually makes more financial sense to pursue My Green Lab than not. And then a lot of the learnings, help you run your lab more efficiently, which ultimately helps you accomplish your research more effectively. It can help you get grant funding, or it can help position your company around sustainability goals that are increasingly important across industry. And it can help you engage your younger staff members in a way that makes them feel more mission aligned with the work. All that combined is, really something that's actually just going to support and accelerate the work that you're doing, not be a barrier.
And certainly the financial end of things might be very high on this list, but that's a great segue into what are the common reasons organizations ultimately decide to pursue My Green Lab certification today compared to maybe 5 years ago?
Yeah, I think there's certainly now, there was an early adopter phase where it was the people that were willing to do new, innovative things, and that attracts a certain personality type. Now that the program and tool is proven, it's more about the ROI and the business case and how do you do it at scale? What are the costs? So you're moving more into talking to like QA/QC managers or HSE teams, rather than just like an innovative scientist that's thinking about how they're going to make some change in their lab. So people are thinking about it more in terms of scale, and then what is the financial benefits of doing it at scale. And then transparently, we get a lot more academic labs that are coming to us because they just won a grant from the Wellcome Trust, or they're applying for a grant from Cancer Research UK, which also has similar requirements. And that, I think that's actually not a bad thing. It's important that you have the early adopters, but we also need to get the rest of the market, and their motivations are going to be much more practical. And so we need to be able to speak to those audiences too. And now that the program really has achieved scale, it's demonstrated impact, it's demonstrated financial savings, there's some market drivers in place, those practical people are more excited about adopting this type of framework as well.
And I think you've already provided a couple of examples just in the early minutes of this conversation, but it seems like sustainability is shifting from kind of this nice to have initiative, we'll do it if we have time, to more of a business requirement because of the financial results. That's just my opinion, though.
No, I think that's exactly right. We just submitted a proposal for a large pharmaceutical industry that's working to make My Green Lab a global standard across all their labs. And there's environmental justification, right? They need to meet certain environmental impact reductions over time. And there's also a financial justification. When it moves from a few labs kind of piloting the project for the innovation capacity to this is a policy decision driven across all our global portfolio, there's a lot of more vetting and decision making that needs to be done. But also, you can have a lot more impact because some of the solutions that we recommend you can't really implement at just a lab level. Like, for example, we're recommending now a lot of alternative treatment methodologies for regulated medical waste. That needs to be like a site or even sometimes a company wide decision because they have a waste management contract. So it allows us to have scale in a way we never had before. And then now that we have these market drivers like the Wellcome Trust, and now the large pharma companies are actually asking their suppliers to get My Green Lab certification as part of their supplier qualification criteria. So those things are all driving significant scale, moving it from a nice to have to an actual business imperative. And I think that's really crucial because if it's going to become the global standard, and if we're going to achieve our mission to build a global culture in sustainability and science, it can't just be a few innovative researchers or a few innovative labs. It really has to be the standard of practice across the whole industry.
And I think the podcast is a really great fit for my green lab in the sense that I really have two large pools of guests, and that comprises the audience as well. On one hand, it's academic researchers who I meet at conferences like the American Society of Mass Spec last week, who come on and share the work with a wider audience. You know, they were at the conference presenting their work, and this gives them a platform to share online some of the work they were presenting in person. But then through my partnership with Separation Science, I also interview a lot of manufacturers. Organimation, my company, manufactures laboratory equipment in Massachusetts. How has the role of suppliers like myself changed in advancing sustainability?
We did a study with Agilent and Frost and Sullivan, which is one of the sort of most recognized global market research firms, independent market research firms, where we surveyed over 500 lab managers all around the world. And one of the consistent things that came back is one, they're all implementing some level of sustainability. I think it was 82%. And then 90% of them expected their vendors to support them in meeting their sustainability goals and requirements. And the reality is, there are certain things you can do in a lab from a behavior change standpoint, like making sure you're closing your fume hood sash, or chilling up your freezers from minus 80 to minus 70, or cleaning out and consolidating. But if you can't buy green lab products, then you can't truly have a green lab. And so vendors become a crucial part of that equation. We launched in 2018 the ACT Eco Label, which stands for Accountability, Consistency, Transparency. And it's the first third party verified eco label, sort of like a nutrition facts that you could get on a box of cereal for sustainability for lab supplies. And prior to that, there was a bunch of organizations that were putting like green leaves on their product, but it wasn't defined to a specific standard. So it's sort of impossible for consumers to make apples to apples comparisons. It's actually interesting. The mass spec industry was one of the first early adopters of ACT, and they were like, well, this makes sense. So now they can be part of the solution. And the beautiful thing, I think, about working with vendors is if they score poorly on the ACT program, everybody's an A student in science. And so they'll actually go back and like innovate and change the products over time. And we've seen that happen like in real time as people are going through the evaluation process. So that helps us go out and spread the word and spread the message. But some of these companies have hundreds, if not thousands, of salespeople or technicians in the field. All of them can be ambassadors for sustainability messaging. So one of the things that we're really excited about is empowering companies like Agilent and Thermo Fisher to get their sales team to be able to go out and not just talk about their products, but talk about sustainability more broadly, and actually bring that message to their customers to help accelerate the movement. And that's been a really great partnership. So I really think suppliers are now thinking of themselves as part of the solution, and how are they a trusted advisor that's going to help you get the sustainability outcomes that you want.
And I've always been, as a manufacturer and as a marketer, very excited about the prospect of having the ACT label on the products we're manufacturing. But you touched on something that I think's really insightful as far as doing the actual evaluation through the My Green Lab process. It would probably reveal a whole lot of things that I don't know now that should be areas of improvement, where there's some metrics I think Organimation would do really well on in terms of our equipment lasting forever and being very responsibly sourced and sustainable. But I'm sure it would reveal just true weaknesses that could really help me improve the products, let's say.
Yeah, I would say, every single product that goes through ACT has opportunities for improvement. And it's sort of the way both of our platforms work. My Green Lab certification very similar. Even labs, and often people tell us, well, we're already doing everything green, and then they'll do the assessment and they'll score a 40%, which is a bronze. And perhaps they're doing a lot on energy, or they're doing a lot on green chemistry, but they haven't thought about waste, or they haven't thought about water. And again, the tools play in nicely in science because you give people the data. How are you performing? How are you benchmarking versus your peers? I also think on ACT, often people are thinking about sustainability really in sort of two ways. Like, is the product itself delivering a sustainable solution? Or yeah, is it made in a sustainable way? When if you think at product level sustainability, there's so much that goes into it: the components of the product, how it's shipped, the packaging, how it's made, renewable energy at the facility, whether the organization's procuring renewable energy. And then we even get into whether the organization has established corporate sustainability standards, greenhouse gas reduction targets. Many times we have people go through it and they're like, wow, we don't buy any renewable energy. We're scoring really bad on that. Have we thought about that? We should actually look into it. And we'll actually like make renewable energy purchases as part of their certification process, which turns out to save them money sometimes, depending on the region they're in and the contracts that they have available. So it's a really cool platform from that perspective.
Yeah, I totally agree. I suppose the answer is it's really everyone's responsibility to really push forward on sustainability in general. Or is it really as simple as like we all have to focus on this to make meaningful change?
I think we definitely all have to focus on it. There's a reality that's important, though, which is if you're making a product for a customer, you are necessarily responsive to what your customer wants. So, as customers, we have to be clear about what we want from suppliers if we're going to get them to make shifts. And I think one of the things that you'll see is a lot of scientists being like, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. Yet that doesn't come with, and then I'll buy your product. Or I will make a commitment to buying your product if you make these changes. So we're really trying to change that dynamic. Often lab supplies, sometimes it's high margin, sometimes it's not high margin actually, and it's very competitive. And so there has to be a business case for them to make significant shifts in the way that they manufacture their product or to pursue programs like the ACT label. And so we're working with some of the largest purchasers, from universities to biotech and pharma companies to the large sales channels, to actually incorporate sustainability as a differentiating factor so that companies can understand if they pursue these initiatives, they're actually going to be able to grow their sales or at least keep their key customers that care about these issues, so that the business case is really clear. So, guess what I'm saying here is there's a responsibility on the purchasers to make their sustainability requirements clear and put their money where their mouth is. And then there's a responsibility on the manufacturers to deliver on those goals and expectations.
Well, that is a way better answer, in my opinion, than just kind of the generic, it takes all of us type solution. Just speaking for myself, to go back to something you touched on earlier, I know going through the process, the idea of renewable energy and how that funnels into the product manufacturing was definitely a blind spot and not something I had personally thought about in terms of organimations. Is there anything that you see manufacturers in the lab space commonly overlooking, that, or maybe that they underestimate when thinking about improving their sustainability profile?
You know, renewable energy, in most regions, you can do renewable energy procurement in a way that's not hugely cost impactful, and should, and you'll see stories about, large corporations signing these big 15-year power purchase agreements. And you're like, wow, that's so great. They're not doing it purely altruistically. They're doing it because they lock in a defined energy price over a 15-year time period. And lo and behold, energy prices just keep going up, and they're going to continue keep going up. So it's in part a thoughtful energy hedge, which is another example of where sustainability isn't like just a cost center. Sometimes it's a business strategy and imperative that's very smart about how do we fit into the future. One of the things that I think in equipment manufacturing that companies aren't thinking about as much is the carbon impact of the materials that they're purchasing, so the location of those materials. And one like very straightforward way to reduce the carbon impact of the materials that you're purchasing is for like metallics, metals, to buy things with recycled content. And then there's really interesting innovation in polymers now, but it's made out of basically like a compressed wood fiber that could be used in a ton of different applications. And it's essentially like carbon neutral because you're sequestering carbon in the product, and certainly much lower carbon than virgin plastics. You can incorporate recycled plastics. And so I think, getting down to like piece by piece, what are the various options from a sustainability standpoint that we could pursue that would reduce our carbon footprint are innovation opportunities that I see kind of overlooked in life science because everybody's just so necessarily focused on the performance of the piece of equipment rather than those other sort of intangible pieces around it. I come from the building industry, and obviously performance of the product is fundamental, but all of the sustainability comes from the inputs. So I think we should be thinking about the inputs quite a bit more.
Yeah, and just somewhat anecdotally, when thinking about my company's footprint, one thing I thought was a real plus for us was how much is locally sourced, and that I know the transportation costs might be a lot lower than some other manufacturers. And certainly there's some components where you have to source from all over the world if they're not made here. Us.
I think that's a great benefit. And I think it was, sort of COVID made us realize that maybe these like unnecessarily extensive global supply chains weren't resilient as well. So there's a resilience benefit that plays into that. But certainly figuring out how you can source components more locally using local materials, that all goes into kind of that exact, like that input product level, product by product basis.
Yeah, and certainly on the R&D side, I'd say the idea that if we need to visit our metal spinner, we're just driving out to Western Massachusetts from Central Massachusetts, because you are able to visit those providers in person and have sit down meetings. And also in the metal space, I would focus on you have a little bit more trust in the quality of the metal. If something's
Yeah.
great, it is 316 stainless steel, you can actually verify that this is what we say it is because you have built up that trust possibly through that in-person communication that we are getting what we're paying for.
And then also when you know your suppliers, then when you're like, hey, can we increase the recycled content of this? Or how, is your facility renewably powered where you're doing the bending and the shaping? Is that something you've considered? So I think, having those closer relationships with your value chain allow you to understand it a little bit better and then also make changes more effectively.
I feel like I'm somewhat aware, at least on the general current topics in the sustainability space at large, whether it's ESG or anti greenwashing. But I have no idea what scope 3 emissions are. If you'd be able to touch on that. And of those three topics, I'd love to hear in terms of the regulatory developments what you think is going to have the most impact over the coming years.
I think the easiest way to think about this, so there's three different scopes that you look at when you're evaluating or you're calculating the carbon impact of either a product or an organization or even an industry. The first is scope 1. That one's very straightforward. It's fuel burned on site by company buildings or vehicles, essentially, or factories. So if you have a natural gas fired boiler or you have a gas car that's a company vehicle and it directly releases carbon into the air, that's scope 1. Scope 2 is the carbon impact again, from your own buildings and your own vehicles, from the electricity that you purchase. So that is sort of grid dependent. They call it indirect emissions because you're not the one emitting the carbon, but you're purchasing the electricity that generally was had some carbon necessary to the creation of that and transmission of that electricity. So that's really like the emissions you can control. Then we have scope 3, and it's separated into both upstream and downstream. So upstream is all the material inputs, employee travel, everything it takes to make the products that you deliver. Then downstream is the impact of your products as they go out into the world. So if you have a device that consumes chemicals or consumes energy, then it's the environmental impact, both of its use phase and its end of life. So it's important to look across all three scopes to understand the full environmental impact of a company or a product. I will say people get really excited about scope 3 because scope 3 is where the majority of impact lies. But that doesn't mean you should forget about scope 1 and 2. And it's important to understand that your scope 1 and 2 is also somebody else's scope 3. So if you're providing a device to MIT, the carbon footprint of the device that you're providing to MIT that's your scope 1 and 2 is their scope 3. So we all have to actually, if we all reduce our scope 1 and 2, then we'll also reduce all of our scope 3 impact as well. Sometimes I hear people be like, well, all we're focusing on scope 3 because that's the most important. It's like, well, no, it makes up the majority of the carbon calculation. But the most important thing is to do things on things where you actually have influence and can drive impact and change quickly.
In the space of sustainability, are there any areas of emerging technology that you're most excited about having a positive impact moving forward?
I think there's a really interesting evolution of how we monitor and manage equipment through very low cost plug load monitors that are connected to networks that can aggregate and evaluate that data so you can see in real time the impact of doing things like changing freezer temps from minus 80 to minus 70. We're working with a company called Claw2 that has a AI predictive monitoring tool. So based upon the temperature data of the freezer, which everybody has to gather, they can tell whether or not the compressor is going off spec and needs to be repaired, which is really exciting. Not only can you extend the lifetime of the equipment, you can make sure it's functioning more effectively. I think there's a lot of innovation happening around waste right now. We partner with a company called Envitech that has a alternative waste treatment methodology for regulated medical waste where instead of autoclaving it, you basically grind it up and disinfect it with a chemical process. And then what you have left over is chemical flock. And there are advanced recyclers that can take that chemical flock, separate it out, and make it back into products. But even just going from the regulated medical waste, autoclave, incineration to mechanical disinfection is like 90% lower carbon. So I think that's a huge area. If you think about it, we're taking some of the highest quality plastics, we're using them in life science, and then we're disposing of them in probably the highest carbon possible way we could do it through steam sterilization and then incineration. And so I think there's a lot of innovation that is going to happen in the waste space moving forward and a lot of new technologies that are going to be coming online.
And one thing I definitely wanted to mention before we signed off today was the ambassador program. And I just checked my LinkedIn page that I had gone through the certification last August, I believe. So it's been about a year. Is there anything you'd like to highlight there in terms of encouraging people to go through it?
Yeah, well, I would first say it's a great like fun kind of crash course, and hopefully you can validate that you enjoyed it. You do have to pass a quiz at the end. People sometimes get frustrated that they had to watch the videos and learn from them, but I think in science it's quite funny when people can't pass the quiz, and that's like, well, watch the videos again, give it another shot, because we do want it to be meaningful that you learned something. We have over 13,000 ambassadors, so we want to activate those a little bit more through getting them to have once every 2 month meetings and actually do some in-person engagements. You obviously become on our newsletter list, and then we communicate with you if we have local events. So it's a great way to just, kind of dip your toes into the sustainability realm. And what we find is a lot of ambassadors then kind of become like the de facto green lab expert in their lab, and they bring to, or at their company if it's a manufacturer. The next thing I would say, if you want to go deeper beyond the ambassador program, is we have our My Green Lab accredited professional. We actually have close to 500 accredited professionals now, where you go in depth on different topic areas, including waste, procurement, water, energy, and community and culture, which is about how you establish a green lab team and build a culture in your company. That's a great way to kind of take the next step.
Yeah, I wrote it down that the accredited professional program exists because, yeah, this is the first time I'm seeing that. So that's really exciting. James, was there anything else you'd like to highlight today? I think we presented a lot of useful information for researchers and people more in my spot on the manufacturing side.
Yeah, I think my final message would be, there's always improvements and change that you can make. And I think it can feel a bit overwhelming, when you look at the sustainability topic or you think about climate change more broadly. And what we try to do is provide clear paths forward where you can make some impact, you can get credit for it, you can measure the results, and you can score yourself so that you can make those incremental improvements. And I think when we break things down into, you know, here's where we're at, here's where we could be, here's the steps to get there in a really practical way, then people are really empowered to make change. So don't get overwhelmed. There's actually a lot of really, really positive stories, particularly in life science. And there's a lot of impact that you can have. And as soon as you start making impact, it builds momentum and people start following behind you. And then you get your certification and other people want to learn about it. So we all have the ability to be a really powerful change agent through sustainability and science. And please connect with us because we'd love to support you in that effort.
Thanks, James. This has been great. I really appreciate your time, and I hope to see you again later this year.
Okay. Thank you. I enjoyed it.